understitching, I was kind of explaining the purpose of this. You're going to see it on a neckline where you would have either your lining or your facing, and you want to keep that under. So if this was like a V-neck, the facing would stay under because of this stitching called understitching that we're about to do. Once you cut your two pieces out, I like to cut them of different fabrics. So this is going to be my garment fabric. So if this was like a top, it would be what you would see. And then this plaid is just going to act as my facing that will go on the inside of the garment. So it'd be this little piece that we end up ironing under. So after you pin it and cut it out, the first thing that you're going to do is you're just going to sew a regulation seam. So a couple reminders with regulation seams. We're going to be doing this across the top. So basically if these were your two pieces of fabric, pretty sides together, 5/8 inch seam, back stitch at the beginning and the end. So I'm going to have my little pretty side up. This side doesn't really have a right or a wrong side. So I'm going to go ahead and place this on top, just like so. Make sure you make your edges even. Anytime you're doing a regulation seam, you need to make sure that you are doing that. So I'm just pinning, making sure my edges are flat and making sure they match up. When you're choosing fabric to cut out, if you want to make your skill a little easier, choose fabrics that aren't super stretchy and difficult to work with. This is a nice easy flannel, so it will listen a little bit better. Okay, so pretty sides together. I've got my tape at my 5/8. All I'm going to do is sew a 5/8 inch regulation seam. I'm going to go ahead and place, or lift up my presser foot, line my edge that I'm sewing with my 5/8 inch tape. I'm going to lock it down. And then I'm going to go ahead and start with a back stitch. Remember, with a regulation seam, you always need to start and end with a back stitch, otherwise your seam's just going to come undone. So I'm going to hold this down, stitch back to the edge, release the button, sew in a straight line, remove your pins as you go. A lot of times people forget, you want to look at your tape, right? Making sure your edge stays in line. The machine does most of the work. Your hand's just there to guide it to make sure it stays straight, and remove your pins. And then once I reach the end, I'm going to do another back stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Perfect. Lift up your presser foot. Okay. Gonna cut my threads off. I like to always get in the habit of getting all your threads off, so that you won't have to go back to this later and do the tedious work of cutting all your threads off. So you'll have 4, 2 at the beginning, 2 at the end. Then what we're going to do before we take this to the iron is you're going to trim your seam allowance in half. Okay, so we have a 5/8 inch seam allowance to get rid of some of that bulk, just like we did with our inside curves and outside curves. You're going to cut it in half. Do not cut it too much, or understitching will not be easy. You're cutting it, in half. You don't have to like measure it, but you're just getting the gauge for reducing the bulk of the seam allowance and cutting some of that off. Okay, so I cut about, half of that off. Then, so looking at this, so again, right now, if I were to, iron this under, and I'm wearing it, you might have like your plaid sticking out like that if this was your neckline, and you don't want that to happen. So this little understitch is going to keep it under, and it's going to look nice and clean. So after you stitch that and you trim it, you're going to take this over to the iron. Onyx, would you mind plugging the iron in for me? I'm going to take this over to the iron, and so the bigger piece is acting as your garment. So that's the right side of whatever you're wearing. This is the facing, so this will be pressed to the inside like so. You are going to press that seam allowance at the iron towards your facing. Okay, you're going to press it just like so. Okay, you're also going to be notching, your seam allowance to give it a little more flexibility. So actually before we iron it, I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So just like you did on your curves, I'm gonna cut some notches. Don't cut through your seam, about every ½ inch or so. My scissors are being a little stubborn. Haven't been used in a little bit. So you'll cut your notches, and then I'll take it over to the iron. It's a lovely sound. You need like some oil or something. They're like, they cut great, but they're struggling a little bit. I'll get as fast as I can. Don't cut through your seam. One more. Okay. Good. Awesome. So then I'm going to take this over to the iron, and I'm going to press it. Remember, you're pressing your seam allowance toward, you can come closer, man, it's okay. You're pressing it towards your facing. So I'm gonna press it. Turn that iron up. So it wasn't very hot, so I'm gonna let it get a little hotter. I'm gonna flip it this way too. Make sure it's still pressing up. Get my seam nice and flat. One more time. So I want that seam allowance toward my smaller piece or my facing. Okay. After you do that, we're gonna bring it back over to the machine. All right. And what you're going to do is you're going to stitch again. Okay, so when you stitch, it's open like this, and you're actually going to be stitching pretty close to your last seam, but on the side to the right where your facing is, and you're gonna back stitch and stitch right next to it. So a little tip with that is I'm gonna line up my seam with the inside of this leg on the left side, and then I'm going to stitch right next to it. I really wish I had the black thread on this side so you guys could see it a little bit better, but what I'm doing is I'm sewing, so my seam is right here, my needle's right here, I'm gonna sew right next to it on the inside toward my facing on my seam allowance and my facing. Okay, so I'll start, and I'm gonna do a back start with the back stitch, release, go ahead and move forward. You'll be able to see this a little better once we're done. Checking how I'm doing on that side. You can see the black thread now, which is looking good. Take your time with this. Make sure your seam allowance stays flat. So a little more hand control here just to help you out. When I get to the end, I'm going to back stitch. Pull my threads out. Cut your threads off. This one's satisfying. Okay, so then what you'll realize is now on the inside, if you look nice and close, your seam allowance is staying flat down. You have your seam, that's the white thread on mine on this side, and you're understitching right next to it all the way down. Okay, and the last step is taking this over to the iron, and you're gonna notice that that's gonna stay under really, really nicely because of that nice consistent understitch and the fact that the heat of the iron will keep this under nice and flat. So I'm gonna take it back to the iron real quick. I'm gonna make sure it's under. You're gonna press it I always press it on both sides just so it looks nice and clean. Press to perfect. And then now you would have your understitching to stay under.